In 2020, Democrats took full control of Washington.
And it will give Democrats control of the Senate.
Joe Biden has been elected.
But Republicans stood up in the states.
There was no blue wave. Democratic down-ballot disasters carried all the way to the state legislatures.
Now, we're the last line of defense against the Democrats' socialist agenda. The ways we're fighting back are bigger than you think.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining episode 19 of It's Bigger Than You Think, a conversation about the politics that most impact your daily life. I'm Rainey Moore, and joining me today is the founder and president of Cygnal, Brent Buchanan. Brent, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, so we are going to talk about some of the polling that you guys did with us over the past couple of weeks. Can you just kind of go over the top lines of that polling and how President Biden is, factoring into how voters are thinking about down ballot state legislative races?
Yeah, definitely. So we conducted a survey over 2 days, January 19th and 20th, and it was across a dozen plus battleground states. So, where the key race is going to be won and lost this year from state legislature, but also U.S. Senate and Congress and governors. Because if it's a battleground, it's a battleground up and down the ballot. And so looking at that, we were trying to assess trends and opportunities within there. And as a whole, Republicans are polling a lot better than Democrats in these battleground states. We've got the issue matrix is on our side. The trust of voters is on our side. Joe Biden is on our side. He's the best thing that's happened to Republicans. We're leading that cumulative generic ballot by 6 points. People really think that the country is completely in the ditch. They feel a little bit better about their states than they do the country as a whole. And if you look at what Democrats are focusing their energy on from a messaging standpoint, it's towards the bottom of what voters are really caring about right now. We've had some carryover from 2020 and 2021 into 22 issues. I would say that COVID is actually a bigger deal now than it was in the 2020 election. And at that time, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what we didn't know. We didn't have vaccines. It was a totally different world in the fall of 2020 compared to now. And now people are just sick of it. And they're sick of it for different reasons. It's a very complicated issue. But that is really top of mind for what they're thinking about. They want to move on and past normal. And so you were asking about, Joe Biden and what role he has in this. His image just really sucks with voters, especially suburban voters, independent voters, even younger voters are really just disgusted with him. And it's only getting worse. One key metric that we look at is the intensity of that unfavorability. And it's very high among those key voter groups that I just mentioned. And I think where the Democrats really messed up is that they totally misread their mandate. Their mandate was make me not worry about who I'm going to see on the news every morning. Calm things down, bring things back to some semblance of normalcy. And they have yet to do anything to address those issues, and focusing on lots of other things that just don't matter in the daily lives of voters. And so if I were to sum up the survey from a top line perspective, is that Republicans are in a great spot right now. We have a tailwind at our back. However, we've got to stay focused on the issues that matter in the individual lives of voters. And that's not every issue.
Sure. So what are those issues that voters are most concerned about right now?
So they're the issues that make an impact on their life. Mm-hmm. So, for example, crime is of a concern, especially to younger voters. All things economic. But more than just the economy, it is the cost of living, the economy of the family, the economy of the individual is feeling that high inflation. They're feeling that cost of living squeeze. They're seeing it every day when they go to the grocery store and half the stuff isn't even on the shelf. They want to go buy a new car and it's $10,000 more than the last used car that they bought. They're seeing these impacts in their individual lives. And the crime issue, kind of the same thing, is it's not necessarily that there is a significant amount of crime. There is. We've definitely seen an increase. They feel like it's closer to them than it's ever been. Mm-hmm. If you live in outside Detroit or outside Minneapolis or outside Denver. Like, you've always known that your city had a crime problem.
But now it's
But
infiltrating the suburbs.
exactly. Or you feel like if it hasn't, it's about to, because it just feels like it's exploding and it's more in your face. And there's just a lot of concern and consternation in voters, because I think a lot of it's driven by the pandemic. We're just sick of it. Like, Fauci was talking today and never gave an off ramp. Like, what does the end of this thing look like? And people are just tired of that. And so they're much more selfish in their voting patterns right now. And I don't fault them for that at all. We just, as Republicans, need to realize that if we're not giving a value proposition on any issue, A, B, C, or D, like, what does this mean to the individual voter, then we're missing our opportunity on messaging any of these topics.
How do you think these issues, on one side, these being the top issues, benefit Republicans, and on the flip side are hurtful to Democrats since they're not talking about them and they're acting like they don't exist? Or Jen, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Psaki, is saying, oh, go take a kickboxing class and drink a margarita and you'll be fine, about, inflation and things like that.
Those of us who enjoy life are already doing those two things. So missed the mark there. But yeah, you're spot on. The top two issues in the survey, and we tested a dozen of them, and we tested them in comparison to each other. Top two issues are cost of living and inflation and the economy in general. And there's not really close third there. Crime and violence is the closest third. But the intensity is really behind those economic issues. And so then we flip and say, okay, well, on these exact same set of 12 issues, what party do you trust? And that's where we're just blowing the Democrats out of the water. I mean, we've got strong single digit, if not double digit leads on that they trust us over the Democrats. There are a couple issues where the Democrats do better than us, and they're just things that are not top of mind. They actually were our lowest performing issues, like climate change and race relations, that are important topics. They're just not important in the overall issue matrix compared to those, personal economic and personal impact, personal safety issues that voters are really focusing on right now.
You mentioned this earlier, but you found that Republican legislative candidates hold a 6-point lead on the generic ballot for the multi-state poll you did. And individual state polling, particularly, Republicans also lead on the generic ballot in Minnesota and Colorado, which are, both blue states. Is this too good to be true? And what kind of explains that shift?
Yeah, there are a couple underlying factors that drive this. And we started to see these things in Virginia. In the polling that we were doing statewide in Virginia, but also in all the legislative districts that were competitive, and we ended up winning and taking over the House of Delegates. And that is that the gender gap has shrunk. But the gender gap has mostly shrunk on the national topics. So Biden's image, direction of the country, it gets a little bit more muddied from a gender gap perspective when you start talking about the individual state's direction.
Can you explain?
Yeah.
Gap? So are like women voting more Democrat, Republicans were more men? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So historically, men have been more Republican and women have been more Democratic. But like on the National Battleground survey, women favor a Republican by 1 point. Traditionally that number would be probably a Democrat by 10, if not 15 points.
Oh, wow.
And so female voters are very much open to looking at Republican candidates right now. The intensity is not necessarily there. There's a lot of softness in that probably category and in the unsure. And that's why it's so important for us to be communicating these personal issues, because interestingly, female voters also are much more concerned about cost of living impact than male voters are. They're more concerned about crime than male voters are. Some of the other issues that are opportunities that we have is that minority voters are more open to voting for Republicans, especially non-college educated voters. Those with lower educational attainment have been trending Republican. The Democrats used to be the party of the working class, and it's really shifting to where they're moving to the Republican Party, and where we can go win 30 to 40% of Hispanics, and we can go win 10 to 20% of African American voters and 10 to 20% of Asian, or 20 to 30% of Asian voters. Those are the coalitions, because they care about the economic issues, and they realize that the Democrats are not the party to address those. And so that's much of what's driving this generic ballot. It is also Biden's image. Like we can't negate the fact that the worse he is viewed with voters, the better it is for us. Because we asked another question too, of, do you want somebody who will support Joe Biden and his policies, or do you want a state legislative candidate that will push back against Joe Biden and his policies? And that was Republican plus 11. Wow. So, we've got a good generic ballot. We've got an even better, what we call a contrast ballot in our favor. And you mentioned Minnesota and Colorado. I mean, those are two states we do a lot of work in, and usually, we're fighting hand-to-hand combat, in the alleys to try to win a seat here and there in these states. They're just challenging. And for two totally different reasons. Colorado has, I think, the highest educational attainment of any state in the nation. And that has changed drastically in the last decade or two. And that's what's driven most of Colorado. The trend in Minnesota is different in that it's a very white state. And so you've got these voters who were traditional blue dog Democrats, those lower educational attainment voters that are now coming over to our side. But in both of those states, we're ahead. I mean, Colorado, we lost by double digits in the presidential race. In Minnesota, I forget it off the top of my head, it was like 7, I think. And so for us to be up in both of those places, but it's just the same thing that we saw in Virginia. We're seeing it play out elsewhere. The voters are tired of the Democrats focusing on all the issues that don't matter to them, don't make an impact in their individual life. And they didn't deliver on their promise to just calm things down. They made them worse in different ways.
So that kind of goes into my next question. Overall, what do you think is driving the country to the right? Do you think it's Biden, his bad image, and the actual radical policies that the Democrats are implementing with their first, term with a fully Democrat-controlled DC? Or do you think it's their absolute ineffective way of governing and the infighting and Democrats in disarray and all of those things, and their inability to kind of deliver on those campaign promises? Do you think that there's one side over the other, or is it kind of a mix?
I'm going to have to pick the check for all the above on this question. Yeah. There's just so much at play. And the reason we lost in 2020, and we picked up seats in Congress, but we didn't overtake Congress. And we had a really great state legislative cycle. Mm-hmm. If you're making the comparisons there, is COVID has really jumbled things up. So that is to me the base underlying issue, because it causes a lot of negative emotions in people. And one thing that we focus on as a firm is understanding how voters feel, because that limbic brain, processes things literally 500 times faster than our logical brain. And it's called the unconscious brain, or the amygdala. It's got a lot of names, but basically it filters everything for us. And it's doing a lot of things in the background that we're not aware of, but we feel these things. And when it sees something that's a threat or an opportunity, they'll fight or flight, saying that, then it informs our logical brain, hey, pay attention to this thing. Mm-hmm. It's like when you buy a car and you're driving around next week and you realize that wow, everybody owns this car. And that's because you attuned your brain to pay attention to something that it was not previously paying attention to. And so I say all that just to pull back into, we've got this underpinning of anxiety in the nation, and fear and frustration and anger. And it's on both sides of the aisle. And that is the foundation on which all this is built. So you have, voters who are looking to not feel those feelings by electing Joe Biden. In 2018, it was mostly just anger, and they did not like Donald Trump, and they were going to take it out on whoever else had an R next to their name on the ballot. Mm-hmm. 2020 was different in that he was on the ballot. And once voters didn't have him in their face every day, it was like a pressure valve was released. But then the Democrats, do what Democrats do, which is they get in and they overreach significantly. And they do way more than their mandate should allow them to do, or what voters were expecting them to do. I mean, kind of look at Obamacare. of 2009 and what that resulted in for us in 2010. And so voters are taking this out on Democrats. I mean, we asked some other questions too, but like, what are you favorable or unfavorable of elected Republicans in your state, elected Democrats in your state? And then same for DC. And the group that performed the best of all of those, including Joe Biden and the federal and state Republicans and Democrats, were state Republican leaders. Like that, they have the best image right now. And it's because we're on message. We're talking about the things that matter to voters. And so to tie it all back together, the reason that Joe Biden has been doing so poorly is that people's view of the economy keeps going south. They're blaming it on him and the Democrats, rightly, as they should, because they're focused on the filibuster instead of focused on, like, how do you make sure that there's milk on the shelf? And when it is on the shelf, it's not $1 more than I paid for it last week. And so we just have to take into consideration how voters feel and why they are focusing on issues A and B over C and D, and make sure that we're attuned to how they're feeling and that we're acknowledging how they're feeling, because the Democrats are giving us a great playbook of what not to do in acknowledging what voters are thinking and feeling.
So there were a couple like state level policy issues that pulled really well. Taxes and school choice are two of those. So you're talking about, messaging in the feelings, essentially. How do you kind of do that with those two issues? And can you kind of just expound on what you found about those?
Yeah, taxes are an issue that voters trust Republicans more than Democrats, as they should. If we look historically at who puts on the taxes and who takes off the taxes, Republicans are the one looking out for the pocketbook. And so we have the trust on our side on that issue of taxes. I think Governor Youngkin in Virginia had really hit the nail on the head. And when I first saw the ad, I was like, well, this is a really random issue to just pick up on. And that was cut the sales tax on groceries, which in Virginia was not a lot, and not a lot of percentage, but it was the thought that counted. And so it was voters looking at it and saying, like, okay, well, that's not going to change my life. However, the dude is trying to do something to help me out here.
It's like a tangible thing.
Exactly. So like, you are thinking about me by offering something that may not have a huge impact in my life, but it does have an impact. And so anything that Republicans can do to cut taxes, to reduce fees, is something that's going to play very well, that this polling shows, because voters are looking for those small little things that say you care about me and you care about this impact on my personal finances, on my family's finances. The other one you mentioned is schools. And, that really became a rallying cry in some of these suburban areas in Virginia in 2021 legislative races, and also in the governor's race, was about parental choice. It was also a very convoluted issue because you had critical race theory, you had these issues in Loudoun County with the school board basically saying, like, screw you, we run this show, parents go back home. You also had, like, the Democrats in the legislature had tried to scale back math requirements to make people not feel bad about themselves, instead of saying, like, let's just get everybody else up to the standard. And the reason I lay all those topics out is because it's not like a silver bullet issue. It's not like, say, parental choice and you win a bunch of votes, and you have to understand, like, where do each of these buckets of people fall and why do they care about those things? And Terry McAuliffe really just gave us a gift on a platter when he said, that parents shouldn't be involved in their kids' education, because he summed up the principle behind all of these topics. And that's one thing too that we preach to our clients is, okay, you find an issue that polls well, peel back the layers and understand what is the principle behind that issue. Because when we can talk about principles and what values we stand for, as opposed to the outcroppings of what that looks like in a particular issue or policy idea, we win a broader coalition of people. Because who doesn't agree that we need transparency in what our kids are being taught, and parents need to have a say in their kids' education? And that another question that we tested on the survey with RSLC was, are schools focused more on, or are they focused too much on pushing partisan political agendas instead of focusing on teaching reading, math, science, writing, the basic skills? And that was an off the charts question, even with Democrats, even especially with independents and parents and younger voters. I mean, kind of these key age minorities, these key age groups that we have all these opportunities with. And so when we can speak to the principle, then we get these broader coalitions, just like on school choice. I mean, we had 61% of Democrats that agreed with the fact that parents should have more flexibility to choose the best school and education for their kids during the pandemic. And that could be vouchers or education savings accounts. And I mean, it's just a broadly popular concept. And so we as practitioners at the state level need to be talking about these issues that are closer to home, that are more personal, that we can actually do something about, while we're saying that we're a check and balance on what's happening with Joe Biden in Washington. And that's kind of the pivot that we need to do from a messaging standpoint of, okay, I care about your individual life. Here's what that means. Here's the principles we agree on. And we're doing all of this to be a check and balance out of the insanity coming out of Joe Biden and Washington, D.C. That's kind of the string of thought we need to be putting in place there, because all these key topics are on our side right now. And I think they'll remain on our side, through November.
So as we're seeing this shift and Republicans are building their message and they're talking about these issues that are really close to home, how should they talk to these independents or even Democrats who voted for Biden in 2020, but we obviously want them to vote Republican in 2022? How do we kind of message to them?
Yeah, it's pain and sense of loss are two of the strongest motivators in life. I mean, just think about like our individual habits. We're not going to change an individual habit until the pain of changing is less than the pain of us continuing. And I think these independents and some of these Democrats, especially older Democrats, we're seeing in the polling data, it's okay to help them acknowledge that, like, that was a good idea at the time for you to try that, but here's been the result of it. And so now we need to try something different. And we can't keep letting this craziness happen. And so I'm going to be there as a check and balance on this craziness. I'm going to deliver on bringing sanity and normalcy to your life. Like, those are the things that I commit to you to do. We're going to focus on the issues that matter, and we're not going to focus on those that don't. And those that don't, we may agree they're important, like the climate, but we're not going to do them today because they're not the pressing issues we need to address. And I'm not going to embarrass you. I'm going to get up there and I'm a person of value, of values and principles, and we agree on these things, and that's who I'm going to be. I'm not going to embarrass you, because I think that that's what a lot of voters are looking at, especially these Democrats and independents. They felt embarrassed by Trump. They thought Biden would fix that. And the ones that are persuadable for us now feel like he's embarrassed them by them putting trust in him to make things normal, and he did the opposite. And so we've got to acknowledge that with him to create that emotional connection with him of like, I agree with you on this thing, but then here's something else we can agree on. Let's focus on cost of living. Let's focus on crime, and let's tackle those issues. And when the next ones come up, I'll come back to you on how you feel on those things. But just keeping the message simple, keeping it brief, and keeping it principles focused while acknowledging how they feel about Joe Biden is how we're going to create that connection with those voters.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Okay, well, that was my last question. So, Brent, thanks for coming on. Do you have any final thoughts today for our listeners?
Yeah, things look great now. We can't guess what they're going to look like in October and November of this year. So all we can do is control what we can control. We can control how many voters we talk to each day. We can control how many fundraising calls we make each day. We can control our behaviors and our habits. And we need to be doing those very consistently so that we can we can capture these opportunities that come to us like these tailwinds, but also be prepared that by somehow Q3, the economy is improving in people's personal lives. The supply chain issues have fixed themselves. COVID isn't top of mind. Like, those are a lot of factors that were driving Biden's image that are driving our tailwind. So we also need to be prepared for the case that those things shift and it shifts our tailwind and we have less of a tailwind. And so that's why it's so important to be doing those fundamentals of a campaign every single day, even though it feels really good right now, because it may not this fall. I think it's going to be good. Is it this great? I don't know. Is it better? I don't know. but we can control the things that we can control, and that's what we need to be doing consistently as Republicans every day.
Yep, I think you're right. Brent, thanks for joining us today and sharing all of the insight from the polling that you partnered with us on. And thank you to everybody for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. And always remember that state politics have an impact that are bigger than you think.